Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very, very senior professional, someone who's really earned the love of a lot of Indians in the last few months, Mr. Salvatore Babones from Australia. Salvatore, welcome to the show.
A pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Salvatore is the Associate Professor, University of Sydney. He's the Director of the China and Free Societies Program at the Center for Independent Studies. So, Salvatore, let's talk about China and India. My first question to you is, when did you first become interested in China?
I started studying China when I moved to Australia. I moved to Australia from the US in 2008, and I had been writing mostly on post-communist transition societies with a focus on East Central Europe, Russia, Poland, Ukraine, and Hungary. And here in Australia, nobody cared about Eastern Europe. All everyone cared about was China, China. And this, of course, was the beginning of the big China boom in Australia. And so I started applying the same analytical tools that I had learned and that I had developed for studying post-communist transition in Europe to the study of post-communist transition in China. And I've quickly found that sinologists, because there is an entire field of sinology, the study of China, sinologists tended not to have systematic knowledge of other countries and other countries' experiences. So what they saw as this is something sui generis distinct to China, I simply saw as another case of post-communist transition. And I might add, my recent work on India, I've also seen India as a post-socialist transition economy and applied many of the same tools to the study of the Indian economy.
Well said. So, I've been going to China since 1989, and I've seen China, when you look at the leadership in China, Deng believed in growth with folded hands. Xi Jinping has started to believe or has believed in the checkbook diplomacy. How do you see differences or similarities in the opening up of China under Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping?
Well, the two slogans, of course, are keeping a low profile and striving for achievement. But I think the transition from one to another was inevitable as China became sufficiently well-resourced to take a more muscular role in the world. I think it was inevitable that China would seek to take a more muscular role in the world and in its own neighborhood, especially in its own neighborhood. So I think there's a lot more continuity than people realize. The rhetoric has changed, but the goals have remained the same. I don't think that Xi Jinping would seem so odd to a Deng Xiaoping. There's a lot of continuity from one to the other.
And why do you say there is this continuity? I mean, their views were completely different.
Oh, I don't think so. They had similar views applied to different circumstances. Both of them have been seeking the rejuvenation of China, viewing communism and state ownership mainly as tools in the toolbox for a nationalist program for a more prominent China in the world. And that's very different. I mean, Xi Jinping is often compared to Mao Zedong, that he's resurrected this cult of personality that Mao had. I think that really is to miss the point. That is, Xi Jinping is not a Maoist leader, meaning that he's not a leader who pursues ideology above all else. I mean, Mao Zedong was clearly willing to destroy his country in order to pursue his own ideological ends. He was a true believer in communism. Of course, he was a true believer in communism with himself at the head. He was not a selfless communist, just like Lenin and Stalin and many communists before him. He thought he was the only one who could bring true communism to his country. But he was very much an ideological warrior. I think Xi Jinping, much like Deng Xiaoping, uses the toolkit at his disposal. Now, of course, Xi Jinping has much more money at his disposal, much more technology at his disposal than Deng Xiaoping did. So the times in which Deng Xiaoping lived required a different accommodation with the West, but specifically with the United States, than the times in which Xi Jinping lives.
Interesting. And staying with Mao and Xi, Xi has been calling upon the teachings of Mao and But now he's got his own little equivalent of Mao's Red Book, which is now being kept on every teacher's table, and children are being asked into getting indoctrinated in the Xi thinking. I'd love to get your perspective. Mao's Red Book was famous. I have a copy of it at home, though I can't understand it. What is the thought behind Xi Jinping of developing his own book?
Sure. I mean, and if you want to pause the recording, I'll go get my little red book as well. But it's not. Look, it's not just Mao Zedong. In Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew. Lee Kuan Yew, Lee Kuan Yew had a book of thoughts. I was given that as a visitor to Singapore, a collection of Lee Kuan Yew thought. In Vietnam, Ho Chi Minh thought is published as so. This is not such a distinctive thing in countries with one dominating and domineering leader. The difference, I think, is sociological. The context in which Xi Jinping's book is being published is very different from the context in which Mao Zedong's is being published, or for that matter, Lee Kuan Yew's book is being published. These are all different contexts, and the different books have different purposes. I don't think very many people are going around with their little copy of Xi Jinping thought, quoting from it and using it to try to have people, put on a stage and lambasted, or to have people whipped and beaten, or to break into people's homes and destroy their belongings. And when someone questions it, they say, look, Mao said so in his little red book. There's no cultural revolution under Xi Jinping. If anything, there's a cultural anti-revolution. I mean, Mao Zedong really did believe in permanent revolution.
Correct.
He was, kept his country in turmoil. Xi Jinping wants anything but a revolution. The last thing he wants is for things to get out of control. So again, although we can make these parallels, you can make parallels between almost anybody in history if you look hard enough. The circumstances are very different.
Well said. Well said. And I've been speaking to many Indian 3- and 4-star generals, and I've been asking them about how prepared India is. I'd love to get to ask you your perspective on what are the chinks in the incredible armor of China.
I would turn that around. Is anyone attacking China? China doesn't need armor because it doesn't have any hostile neighbors. So this massive Chinese military buildup can only be seen from the standpoint of an expansionist power that wants to extend its influence across its borders. India, there's no scenario under which India would attack China, even to gain back territory that India considers its own territory. There's no scenario under which this would happen. So, chinks in the China armor, I know it was just a metaphor on your part, but it is a very apt metaphor because China has built this massive military infrastructure for seemingly no purpose other than hostile offensive war. And that's why we really need to be very concerned about it. I mean, what are the chinks in it? Of course, there are vulnerabilities in China. I'm not a defense expert. Your 4-star generals are probably better placed to expose them. But I do think that the China story has been vastly overblown. I mean, we talk about China invading Taiwan. Well, China could invade Kinmen and Matsu, which are a few kilometers off its coast. China does not have the capacity to invade Taiwan, that is the island of Taiwan across the Taiwan Strait. I mean, no country has the capacity these days to perform an amphibious landing. Not even the United States has the capacity for an amphibious assault on that scale. Similarly, in the Himalayas, China may have a small number of advanced 5th-generation fighter planes, but it doesn't have air-to-air refueling capacity. It doesn't have the proper. I mean, it has a lot of road infrastructure, but it doesn't have the proper air infrastructure to be able to pose a real threat to the Indian Air Force across the Himalayas. So yes, China can do thuggish things like attack people with clubs and iron spikes on them, and it can cause a lot of ruckus along the border. But I don't think China, at least not yet, has the capacity to engage in large-scale offensive warfare in the Himalayas. So I think a lot about China has been overblown. But of course, we hope that this, my opinion, doesn't get tested. We all hope that there won't be a conflict where we find out.
I agree. But yet, I want to also understand that, I was reading, and much more, China seems to have a disagreement on boundaries with every single country that it has a border with, including water borders with like the Philippines.
Yes and no. I mean, it's settled its boundary disputes with Russia. Those are probably the most serious boundary disputes, and I believe those have all been settled now. If they haven't, there may be technical issues, but they've essentially been settled. And the new border disputes China has have been created by China. So these maritime border disputes didn't exist 20 years ago. They only exist because China keeps pushing out its borders further, not because it actually has organic disputes. I mean, China and the Philippines should have nothing to argue about, except for the fact that China has decided to push on this. China and Vietnam had a border war in 1979. That's a long time ago. They should have nothing to argue about today, except that China has started pushing in the maritime domain, harassing Vietnamese vessels, for example, drilling exploratory oil wells. So these problems are really being manufactured by China. They're not something structural about China's position. If China were happy, like almost every other country in the world, except for Russia, if China were happy just to live in its own borders, it would face no threats whatsoever from anyone.
Well said. And yet, if you were to now move to the money power of China, which also seems to be under some kind of stress, over the last 7-8 years, China has put serious money into the the OBOR,
One Belt, One Road,
One Belt, One Road, or the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, and so on and so forth. But they seem to be creating challenges with every single government, whether in Africa or in Europe or wherever else. What are your perspectives on how long can their reserves keep funding?
So here you're in an area where I have much more expertise. Belt and Road, again, has been vastly overblown. China has rebadged many projects as Belt and Road projects that never were intended to be. They keep re-announcing funding for the same project, which then people add up these funding announcements. They come to some enormous number, but they're not actually happening. It has abandoned many projects. So, for instance, the rail project from Yunnan to Singapore has been abandoned. And why? Because the transit countries, in particular Laos, weren't even willing to pay. Laos, I believe, was not even willing to pay a 10% portion of the cost of that rail. Similarly with Pakistan, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, many people love to draw that line on the map. And, China will have a port in the Arabian Sea at Gwadar. The fact is that the infrastructure linking Gwadar to Xinjiang doesn't exist. The highway that China built was destroyed by avalanche. It then was closed by terrorism. It is a thin little high altitude straw through which it's impossible to draw any meaningful economic quality. Now, it does serve as a military corridor. China could move troops into Pakistan in the unlikely event that some emergency like that were to occur. But it's economically meaningless. Gwadar has remained a white elephant project. It's not completed. It probably never will be completed because there's no purpose for a port in Baluchistan. So a lot of these projects, if you drill down into the details just aren't there. And it's been similar with, for example, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, which I've studied in some detail. There were huge announcements of $100 billion capital for the bank. Now, you're a business person, I'm not, but my understanding is that with $100 billion capital, you could probably make loans totaling $2 trillion. Right? But in fact, in its first few years, they only made, I think, I forget the number now, but it's less than $20 billion worth of loans. That is, they haven't even lent out the amount of their capital, never mind the amount that they could borrow. So these have been, so the idea that China is, the lines that people draw on the map for Belt and Road look much more impressive than the actual content. So I'll just give you one final example. The big rail corridor, I mean, virtually every Chinese city claimed to have a rail corridor with a city in Europe. This was very fashionable for 5 years, establishing rail corridors. Now, of course, the Ukraine war has disrupted almost all of that. But even when it was operating, Even if you go back 2 or 3 years, the total volume of trans-Eurasian rail shipments was less than shipments from the port of Shanghai in a single day. Forget about the port of Guangdong, the port, forget about all the other ports, of Guangzhou, sorry. The port of Shanghai one day outweighs the entire corridor. So, the lines look impressive on a map. Economically speaking, they're just not economically important.
Fascinating. My next question to you is on the Quad. It started with Australia, Japan, USA, India. And now I'm told that Israel, Vietnam also want to join the Quad. It started as an economic grouping, but now I'm told it's become more a political grouping and a security grouping against China. What are your thoughts?
There have been 3 Quads, and the first 2 Quads, all they share is the name. So the first Quad in 2012, 2013, was never really operational. It was just an idea in the head of the Japanese prime minister. There were a few meetings, but it didn't actually do anything. I mean, really, it arose from providing relief from the Indian Ocean tsunami. Is where the cooperation came from, but it was not an institutionalized functioning grouping. It was simply an ad hoc arrangement. The second Quad, the Quad that we all know, that's associated with Donald Trump, meeting with Narendra Modi, and in Australia, Scott Morrison. The second Quad was a real effort at establishing maritime security cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And there's a real rationale for it. The idea that the 4 major democratic maritime powers, not all the democracies in the region, just the maritime powers. South Korea was not in it. New Zealand was not in it. There were many democracies that were not in the Quad. The democracies that had serious maritime capacity in the Indo-Pacific region would work together on maritime security. There was a lot of logic to that. And, the Trump administration was even talking about constituting a first fleet that might be based in Darwin or in Perth. And that would be a multinational fleet effort. So not just doing exercises on an ad hoc basis, but having a rotating presence that people work together continuously. Okay, it was a great idea. But then came the elections in the U.S. So with the transition in 2021 to the Biden administration, Joe Biden immediately in January 2021 downgraded the Quad. Now, of course, he didn't say I'm downgrading it. He said I'm upgrading it. But he converted it from an organization focused on maritime cooperation or maritime security to one focused on coronavirus cooperation, global warming, and development. Well, there's no reason why the 4 major Indo-Pacific maritime democracies should be doing coronavirus cooperation. I mean, anyone could do coronavirus cooperation. There was no rationale for the Quad anymore, and thus the Quad really ceased to exist at that point. Now, the second nail in the coffin came with the passing of the former Japanese prime minister, who was a very strong proponent of the Quad. And then the final nail was the election of Anthony Albanese here in Australia, from the Labour Party. He had seems to have no real appetite for promoting this kind of regional maritime security cooperation. And again, he signed on to the Biden agenda. Yes, we're going to do this. This is health cooperation. This is development cooperation. So, there's no, would Vietnam join? Would Kenya join? I mean, it doesn't matter. Absolutely. Anyone could join it at this point. It's just become another one of those empty global organizations. And believe me, the world is littered with organizations you've forgotten about, absolutely, that nonetheless still exist, still have some secretariats, still have some meetings. So we will have a Quad meeting in January, or I think February of 2023 here in Australia. But the Quad meeting is just an opportunity for regional prime ministers, presidents, and foreign ministers to get together. It no longer has any meaningful substance.
Fascinating. And now I'm going to move to the last segment of our conversation. I want to talk to you about India and China.
Sure.
We've been seeing for a long time in the 62 war, where my father was part of that war. It was what used to be called the Hindi Chini Bhai Bhai, which is Indians and Chinese are brothers, and yet they attacked India, and we got a drubbing as Indians. To today, where you spoke about the sticks and the wires and so on, where India claims something else and China claims something else, where do you see India-China relations going? Because the trade seems to have crossed over $100 billion.
Trade statistics really don't mean much. Trade in today's world is no longer bilateral.
Okay.
India or any other country simply imports things from the global market, and where those things are produced really just depends on who's the low-cost producer. So I think it simply is. It's not very productive to focus on trade because India does not have a trade relationship with China. Indians buy TV sets, and where are TV sets made? They're made in China. So they'll buy from China. And just like when India buys oil, it's going to come from oil-producing countries. And it's not driven by the bilateral relationship. It's just a fact of life. Now, the place we do see more decoupling is with technology networks. So obviously, India, a couple of years ago, severely limited the ability of Chinese technology networks to operate in India. Getting rid of TikTok was the big headline move, but other technology providers as well. And that separation is probably good for security in India. I think any large country should aspire to have some kind of basic autonomy.
Correct.
When it comes to critical technology networks. And certainly, if they're not going to be autonomous, they should at least depend on open global networks, not on the networks of a totalitarian regime, a potentially hostile totalitarian regime. So the technology, certainly there is a decoupling of the Chinese and Indian technology spheres. But the coal is going to come wherever the coal comes from. Sure. The TV is going to come from wherever the TV comes from. Okay. The relationship has really very little to do with that.
Salvatore, one more question I wanted to ask you was the economic progress of China, and what is its impact going to be?
Everyone always says that China raised 300 million people out of poverty, and the Chinese economy has grown just incredibly for the last 4 decades. In reality, all China did was stop keeping 300 million people in poverty. That is, it lifted the lid on the economy. China's economic management at this point is no better than Mexico's, in the sense that China's GDP per capita still has not caught up with Mexico's GDP per capita. What's happened, and the real way to understand the Chinese growth of the last 4 decades is to realize that China, for 2 centuries or so, had a series of extraordinary economic misfortunes, whether that was the Opium Wars or later the Civil War in China, Japanese occupation, Maoism, all of these, Great Leap Forward, all of these terrible events that kept the Chinese economy down. When Deng Xiaoping simply lifted the lid and said, we're going to let people pursue their own wealth, the Chinese economy rapidly shot up to a level commensurate with its level of governance. That is, China is a reasonably well-governed country with a functioning state and functioning institutions. It should have roughly a middle-income level of income. And that's what happened. That's why since 2017, China's growth has been very slow. Because once China reached middle-income status, its growth slowed to a crawl. And don't believe the statistics. All the independent economic estimates are that China's economy has hardly grown, 1 or 2% a year, maybe 3% at most since 2017. Now, that same lesson can be applied to India. Why is India growing so fast? Well, because after 1991, India started liberalizing and opening up the economy. Of course, it wasn't the same kind of big bang liberalization as in China. It's been a slower process of liberalization, and accordingly, there's been a slower rebounding of the Indian economy. But in the same way, I would expect India to grow at least until middle income status, by which point, 2045, 2050, it will have overtaken China in GDP, total GDP. And that's the point at which India will also have to wrestle with this question. Okay, we've stopped destroying our economy. Can we now learn how to grow it?
Well said. So that leads me to one more question. And you said you spoke about the GDP per capita still being low. It's often been said about China today and maybe India after 20 years that China will grow old before it gets rich. What are your thoughts?
It's often said, but it's not very meaningful. Look, those of us who study Chinese growth have been saying that, well, myself personally, since 2011. It's certainly true, but it's true because it's a truism. The reason the growth is stopping is not the demographic profile. The reason the growth is stopping is poor governance. Now, the positive demographic profile that China used to have benefited its growth despite China having poor governance. But both China and India will grow until a point that the economy reaches the level of governance that prevails in its society. At that point, then the growth gets difficult. And whatever the demographic headwinds at the time, China's will be much stronger headwinds than India's. But either way, both countries will need improved economic governance in order to reach the kinds of levels of output that prevail in Western countries or Japan or South Korea.
Well said. Now the two leaders, and this would be my last question to you, the two leaders, Mr. Modi and Mr. Xi, where do you see, they started off in Prime Minister Modi's first term. I think there were 4 or 5 or 6 meetings between the two.
Yeah.
And yet it's not it doesn't appear to be the same kind of a relationship any longer. In two of the largest populated countries in the world, where do you see the leaders heading? And do you see these relationships changing?
Well, of course, India and China are both members of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and they are neighbors, and the issues are going to arise that require discussion. The Chinese attack across the border in Ladakh, or not the border, I'm sorry, across the line in Ladakh, was mysterious. No one quite understands it, and there are a lot of theories. Was this actually ordered by Xi Jinping, or was this done to embarrass Xi Jinping? I believe that Narendra Modi was actually in Beijing at the time, if I remember correctly. So it certainly wasn't something that ordinarily a host country would do. So it was a very confusing moment. Now, Chinese politics are very opaque, and so we don't know what the causes are for these sort of things. Now, just because the leaders are not meeting, that doesn't mean that communication is closed. And I assume, and I certainly hope, that communication is very much open. Leaders' meetings are symbolic events, and you can't have that symbolic event unless you have real progress in relations. So it's not that we need a leaders' meeting to iron out the problems. You have to iron out the problems in order to facilitate the leaders' meeting. And look, ultimately, it's going to happen. The question is, how and when. But we all hope, and we're all, not just hope, I think we're all very confident there won't be a shooting war across the line of actual control. And short of that, eventually the relationship will be repaired. Well
said. And on that note, Salvatore, thank you so much for speaking to me. Thank you for talking to me about China. I think I've learned many, many new things about China from you today. Thank you for talking to me about what's been happening in the Quad. And finally, thank you for talking to me about India and China and our two leaders. Thank you again, and good luck.
My pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website, www.tbcy.in, to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.